I have a new TV show on Newsmax TV on Saturdays at 7:30. Tune in. You'll enjoy it.
The intervention of the FBI in American politics is something that politicians have encouraged for its entire history. It's not the Bureau's fault. It's the fault of the politicians that ran the agency. But nevertheless, the heritage of political intervention runs deep in the ethos of the agency, even though the Bureau will never admit it. The FBI was founded in the 1920s, partially as a reaction to the murder of Charles Lindbergh's son and the need to federalize the crime of kidnapping, and the bank robbery and the Dillinger episodes and robbing banks and Al Capone and that whole era of organized crime spawned the FBI. But from the beginning, the FBI was misused by politicians to punish their political opponents. The first misuser was Franklin Roosevelt, who, when he was pushing American intervention in World War II, encouraged J. Edgar Hoover, who took over the Bureau in the 1920s, to keep lists of those who wrote letters opposing his speeches on the need to aid Britain and the need to reinstate the draft and to give Britain American destroyers. He even at one point asked Hoover to dig up information on his opponent in the race for president, Thomas E. Dewey, but Hoover back then refused. But in 1948, when Truman was running against Dewey, Truman was very hostile to the FBI and felt it to be a sort of incipient Gestapo. And as a result, Hoover backed Dewey covertly and fed Dewey all kinds of negative information on his Republican primary opponent, Harold Stassen, in 1948, and then on Truman in the race for president of 48, and unearthed a very important scandal where Truman's chief aide, Vaughn, had received a gift from an industrialist. And that was the big scandal of the Truman administration, outed by the FBI to try to drive Truman out of office. After the 1950s, when we got into the civil rights era and into the Vietnam War controversies of the 60s, the FBI played a key role in trying to quash domestic dissent. J. Edgar Hoover was a total racist, hated Martin Luther King, and in cahoots with Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, wiretapped King and got information on all kind of King's liaisons with assorted women and helpfully mailed them to his wife, along with a note to King that he was doing it, saying that suicide might be your best option, literally encouraging Martin Luther King to kill himself. These kind of dirty, underhanded tactics proliferated in the 60s against civil rights leaders and also against those who were fighting for peace in Vietnam and opposing the Vietnam War. When Nixon took over, he used them to a tremendous extent in monitoring domestic dissent. But even Hoover had his limits, and Hoover at one point kind of drew a line and said, I'm not going to do any more of this because it's endangering the agency. The Bureau was all to Hoover. And in frustration, Nixon moved a lot of the surveillance and a lot of the dirty tricks into the White House, saying the FBI won't do it, so I'm going to do it. And that led to the various units that were formed in the Nixon administration to harass political opponents, to examine tax returns, to retaliate against enemies, to bug the offices of their psychiatrists and doctors, and led ultimately to the Watergate scandal. After Watergate, the FBI kind of reeled in retreat, and it became more and more under siege. During the 1970s, the Church Committee exposed a lot of the abuses of the FBI and the CIA. And throughout the 80s and 90s, those agencies were relatively weak and indeed rocked by scandal because of the breaches in their own security. The FBI hit an all-time low in capturing Russian spies, and the Russian spy rings had a field day with the FBI's incompetence, and the Bureau was humiliated time after time. Then in the 60s, then in the first decade of the 21st century, the 2000s, the FBI had a new role in life as a counter-terror center. And under Bush, its powers expanded exponentially through the Patriot Act in our effort to root out terrorism. And the FBI was very effective in doing it, and very loyal to the program of the Bush presidency. But when Obama took over from Bush, he completely transformed the FBI from a conservative, anti-communist, anti-terrorist institution into a radical left-wing hotbed of anti-Israeli, progressive, left-wing democratic sentiment. And it really changed the agency from red to blue. When Obama took over the FBI, he completely transformed it into an instrument of his will. The powers that the FBI developed for domestic surveillance increased enormously, and the political intervention continued and rose, but it shifted from a right-wing one to a left-wing one.